Good evening and welcome to Plain Talk. My name is Christopher Ram. Thank you for joining me this evening for the next hour as we continue a discussion which began last week by attorney at law Ms. Melinda Janki, who has taken a very prominent lead role in the discussions about petroleum operations in Guyana. Melinda is no stranger or newcomer to the sector, she having worked with an oil company and probably understands the inner workings, the soul, the mind of oil companies. So Melinda, thank you very much for joining me again.
Chris, thank you very much for having me back on the show. And you've startled me by suggesting that oil companies have a soul. I'm not sure that that is in fact true.
I was using it in a neutral sense rather than some kind of angelic spiritual sense. So, but that's
No,
fine.
Definitely
Now,
not.
I want to go back to where we were last week. You are skeptical about the overall financial benefits of oil to this country. Are you?
I'm not sure skeptical is a strong enough word, Chris, but it's a good one. We can start with that.
Yes.
I think there are a number of problems, but maybe the underlying problem with oil in Guyana is that people are telling the Guyanese a lot of lies. We're hearing outlandish statements from the government, and when you ask them for proof, you can't find a minister or a government official to provide any evidence to back up what they've said. So these promises of vast wealth, when you ask them, well, where is the evidence to back up those numbers? It's not there. You have organizations saying how much money Guyana will get and how people will benefit. Again, no evidence. You have the World Bank now getting involved and coming in and lying to the people of Guyana and telling them that they are going to help to improve the legal and regulatory framework, when in fact what they are proposing to do is to dismantle Guyana's environmental protection.
But let me ask you this, Melinda, and you make a case very persuasively. But it is quite true, isn't it, that given our small population and the reserves of hydrocarbon, petroleum reserves that have been discovered to date, in another few years, Guyana will be at the top of the world in terms of barrels of oil produced relative to the number of Guyanese.
So what?
That a barrel of oil clearly translates to economic value.
You mean we can sell it and get some money?
Yes.
Right. So that leads almost automatically to the phenomenon we call the oil curse. So the other big lie that we're hearing is that there is a resource curse, and lots of countries have had a resource curse, and there are ways to deal with it. We're not talking about a resource curse. We're talking about an oil curse, which is a very specific phenomena, and one that requires people to approach it in a very different way. Now, it's called an oil curse because it has a terrible impact on countries, and we don't have to look very far to see that. And maybe I can just show your viewers this particular publication, The Oil Curse, and it's entirely devoted to explaining why oil has been such a disaster for countries. And this is, if I could just start with the opening of this book. Since 1980, the developing world has become wealthier, more democratic, and more peaceful. Yet, this is only true for countries without oil. The oil states scattered across the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia are no wealthier or more democratic or peaceful than they were three decades ago.
That catches a whole set of things. No more,
Yeah.
no wealthier, no more democratic. But
Yep.
because if you were to take, say, Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
they have done remarkably well in terms of economic returns to citizens. Forget human rights, the rights of women, etc. Isn't that also true?
I don't think you can forget human rights. I don't think you can forget the rights
No,
of
but-
women, which are in fact very, fundamental part.
But
of
they're not
human rights.
they're not linked to oil in any way.
Of course they are. Saudi Arabia is a repressive regime, and it can continue to be a repressive regime for a number of reasons. One of which is oil. What makes oil different is the revenue stream. First of all, it's huge. Generally, the amount of money that is coming in from oil is large. In Guyana's case, the amount that will actually come to Guyana is relatively small. We know that because we know the government has given away at least 87% of the value of the oil, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
So the revenue is usually quite large. It's an unusual source. It's out there. In this case, it's 120 miles offshore, so we don't actually know very much about it. And it's secret. And secrecy in revenue is a very big problem.
When you say it's secret, we have a Natural Resources Fund Act. We have joined the Extractive Industry Transparency International, where receipts are disclosed and have to be disclosed. They're subject to audit. So why is it not transparent?
It's not at all transparent. When we come back to the source, the money goes direct to the government.
Yes.
So they don't give a damn about taxpayers because they're no longer accountable to them, and the taxpayers don't see that money. Governments hide the true amount of money that they're getting. And I hear what you say about receipts and so on. I think you were one of the people, perhaps the main person responsible for outing the government on the 18 million secret payment that they made under the contract with SOS and CNOC Nexon. That's the only payment that we know about. Can you say to me that there have been no other payments in the oil sector other than that? No other secret payments? Can you guarantee that?
Well, nobody can guarantee a secret.
No,
it's
one
like
can
proving a
guarantee it.
negative.
Well, quite.
But
So
it's also true, and the agreement is now the petroleum agreement is public. We know the money that is collected by the GGMC, for example, on
Are you talking
rentals. Yes, on the
On
rentals.
oil?
Yes.
Mhm. We know the money that the GGMC say they have collected, and we know what
Well-
money is receipted for. You don't need me to tell you that there are quite a number of payments that go on in this country for which no receipts are ever issued. So I think we need to not try and be naive or clever about this. And those two things often seem to be at opposite ends. But really, with oil in particular, governments are able to hide the money that they're getting. Governments cut secret deals. Look at the oil countries. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. It's a very repressive society with very little freedom. China is an oil country. Iran, Iraq. Just look at Venezuela, which is next door. Look what governments do with oil revenue. Nigeria. They hanged Ken Saro-Wiwa and 9 of the Ogoni people because they were objecting to what the government was doing.
You're not talking about the UK with oil. You're not talking about Norway.
I'm definitely not
You're
talking
not talking
about
about
that.
Canada.
So,
You're not talking about the United States. All of those places.
Yeah.
And can you blame oil for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you take Norway, and Norway is a wonderful example. People always tell me, oh, but the Norwegians managed. Of course they did. They're a very different society to Guyana. They have very high standard of living. They have very high standards of education. I don't think that there is any comparison between Guyana and Norway. They don't have the problems we have. They don't have the divisions that Guyana has. They were never colonized, for example. So they don't have that history. The United Kingdom, well, they're an interesting example because if you ask the United Kingdom where is the oil bonanza, they will struggle to tell you because the money has been spent and there is actually very little to show for it. The Netherlands, which is another country that is extremely well off, well, I mean, one has to have a certain sympathy for them because they gave us the Dutch disease. We call it the Dutch disease. The Netherlands has, of course, done very well out of its oil since then. But these are countries in Europe, which is a very different thing altogether. You come to the United States of America, which was another country that you mentioned. They're seriously influenced by the fossil fuel industry and not for the better. And they have a president that denies climate change. In 2019, the head of state is still saying that climate change doesn't exist, that he doesn't believe it, that he's not prepared to look at the science. Now, how completely ridiculous that is. And that is all to do with
But again,
oil.
to blame oil for it...
It's oil, because people want the oil money. And there are a small number of people that benefit when you have oil. Oil money does not benefit the population at large, with the exception of Norway.
Do you suggest then that Nick Clive Thomas's proposal to send checks to each household would be the way to ensure that the oil revenues go to the people?
I think that's the way to create galloping inflation.
So what is it you really are arguing for, Melinda?
I'm saying that oil is a curse. And once people understand that it's an oil curse, not a resource curse, then people can make a decision as to what they want to do. But stage one is for people to understand the problem before they try to find a solution.
Okay, what's the problem?
The problem with oil is that it destroys and damages countries. When I ask people, show me a country that has done well out of its oil, Norway is the only example that people can come up with. Now, when we talk about the resource curse, and the World Bank does this very nicely in this lovely sort of fairy tale project document that they have created in which they heap misstatement upon misstatement, and they talk about the resource curse. Well, if you pretend that the oil curse is a resource curse, then life becomes a lot easier. And so what they do is they compare Guyana to two other countries, and they say, well, there may be a resource curse, but Canada has managed to deal with the resource curse. Yes, Canada has managed to deal with the resource curse. And why are we comparing Guyana to Canada? Ask all the Guyanese diaspora in Canada whether they think they'd rather be in Canada or in Guyana. I mean, it's a completely daft comparison. The other example they give is Botswana. Wonderful thing about Botswana, very successful, done a lot. Botswana doesn't have oil.
Oil, that's correct.
So why is the World Bank in this project document, the only examples they can find are Canada, which has got very little in common with Guyana, apart from the fact that it's got a lot of Guyanese living there. And why compare it to Botswana? Are there no other countries that they could have said? Why did they not, for example, suggest Chad? The World Bank had an enormous project in Chad, which was supposed to bring enormous benefits to people. And at the moment, Chad is right down at the bottom of the Human Development Index and is one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. That is what happens with oil. Nigeria. You don't need me to tell you about Nigeria. I already mentioned Ken Saro-Wiwa and the fact that they've killed people. Indonesia. The oil is in West Papua. The Indonesians are illegally occupying West Papua and torturing people and killing them. That's because of the oil. They want the oil. Venezuela, let me tell you what the Venezuelan minister said, right? Because it's such a lovely quote, and it's too good to miss. He said, this is Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, former Venezuelan oil minister, and he says, it is the devil's excrement. We are drowning in the devil's excrement. Well, Venezuela should know because they've got probably the biggest reserves on the planet.
Let me ask you this. Can you imagine a world without oil?
Of course.
How do you it's the very, and no pun intended, it's what drives an economy. What are you going to do? You're going to go with a sailboat every flight every time you want to travel from one continent to another, you ignore airplanes?
Well, Chris,
how would you do it?
you asked me if I can imagine a world without oil.
Yes.
And the answer to that is yes, I can. And probably in your lifetime, you will also have to imagine a world without oil, because there is something called the climate emergency.
Yes.
And we don't actually have a choice. Whether we can imagine it or not, we don't have a choice, because we cannot continue to put greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. And that's why the world is moving away from fossil fuels. We're in a little bubble here where we think that there is a future for the oil industry, when in fact there isn't.
You know, there is conflicting. You've got views that say, look, it's not happening. But my question to you, which is a follow-up, could you imagine the developments that have taken place? Would we have been here had we not had oil to fuel all the engines, all the machinery, all the equipment that have driven the economic development?
So what, Chris? It hasn't made the world a better place, and we don't judge it on economic growth, because I think that is exactly the problem. When you assess a society only on the basis of economic growth, then you're heading for trouble. You have to assess a society.
I didn't say only. You're saying that.
No, but you're saying we wouldn't have had this without. We wouldn't have had all this growth. We wouldn't have had all this development.
How long would it take us to move from one continent to another, for example?
I have no idea, but at the moment we can do that very quickly. The problem is we can't put any more greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. So whether we like it or not, there is a constraint. You can't have infinite growth on a planet with limited resources.
But the constraint, Melinda,
yeah,
is separate from abolition.
It's going to come, Chris, whether people like it or not. And the only question is when. Will it happen in your lifetime and mine, or is it going to happen at some time later? But there is a climate emergency right now on the planet. And the politicians are reluctant to engage with it, because so many of them are influenced by the fossil fuel industry. So many of them are afraid of what will happen if the economy has to move off of oil. And I'm sure that people are tired by now of hearing me say that there is a carbon bubble in the economy, and that's why the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, is telling oil companies they must write down those reserves. Otherwise, we are facing a global collapse in the economy, because oil companies are hugely overvalued. And there's an oil company, ExxonMobil is no longer in the top 10. We are faced with a declining industry.
I don't think you can say it's declining. ExxonMobil is not declining. Its revenue has been growing. What has happened? You have companies like Amazon and Facebook. Those companies are growing, but to say that the others are declining, not quite accurate.
Let's have a look at this.
Sure.
So this is from IEFA. This is Tom Sanzillo, who is the IEFA Director of Finance.
Right.
He said, we saw ExxonMobil borrow money last quarter to pay shareholder dividends. For ExxonMobil to be missing from the top of the Standard & Poor's is further evidence of the sector's declining fortunes. And then he goes on to say, this is not some temporary aberration. The oil and gas sector is in decline. Profits are shrinking and investment...
Well, that's not true.
Let me finish. You take it out with Tom. The oil and gas sector is in decline, profits are shrinking, and investment options problematic. And he goes on to say that this is true even for companies like ExxonMobil that historically have deep pockets. I think Tom is absolutely right. And if you go and look at, for example, BlackRock, which is the world's biggest investor, they've lost 90 billion over the last decade because they didn't take into account the financial risk of investing in fossil fuel companies. And so there is a report which says that what was responsible for the bulk of their losses was their investments in the world's biggest oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and BP. So the evidence is there. This is a declining industry, and the returns are not there.
You know, it used to be said, and a few centuries ago, that look, the world is going to collapse under the weight of population, that it could not sustain the famous Malthus.
Yeah, and
that didn't happen.
That's because the unsustainable population was in Europe. And Europe solved its overpopulation problems by going to places like North and South America and exterminating the native inhabitants and taking the land, and going to places like Africa and taking the land, and going to places like Asia. So that's how they got around.
No,
Malthusian
that's not true.
problem.
That's not
Absolutely,
true.
that is how they did
Productivity
it.
is what has driven it.
No, the Europeans got over their population problem by going to new countries, and they settled in new countries. We don't have new countries to go to, and it's only lunatics like Elon Musk who are talking about going to another planet, right? But that is the equivalent now.
My concern, and listen, I share some of the reservations you have, but I am concerned that we have some prophets of doom that look for every single argument that is adverse and then blow it out of proportion.
Well, that may very well be the case, but I think what we should just deal with in this show is the facts, and we should look at what has happened in other countries. So we can look at countries that have oil. I gave you a list of them. So Nigeria, one should look at Nigeria and see what oil has done to Nigeria. Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, and so on and so forth. And your viewers don't need me to list every single country that's got oil. They can do this themselves if they particularly want to. But I don't think there is any doubt that there is an oil curse, and that if the Guyanese people really think that they want to do oil, then they must understand what that oil curse is and be prepared to deal with it.
So
but
what
it's
would
no good pretending that it isn't there.
What would be your suggestion for Guyana on oil? Leave it in the ground?
I think almost certainly, because, and I can explain that to you, because this has probably shocked your viewers. But Guyana is entering a field or an economy that is in decline. That's a very foolish
That's
thing
a questionable
to do. I don't think it's
proposition.
It's not questionable at all. If you've got a sector that is the worst performing sector, it's declining.
Where is it? Where is it the worst performing sector? That's not true.
The energy sector is the was
No,
the
that's
worst
not
performing
true.
sector in
That's not
2018.
true.
Yes, it is. And you can go back to AIFA and look at their analysis of the different sectors for 2018, and they have produced a report which says that the energy sector was the worst performing sector for 2018.
Now,
So it's there. Now, you might not like the analysis, but I'm just giving you AIFA's analysis.
I'm not.
and-
It's not a question of whether I like it or not. It's whether I believe it.
Okay, so
Whether we do sufficient disaggregation. Are we? What is? And I don't accept the figures. I can tell you that. But what about what role does coal play? Because I'm telling you,
coal is hugely in decline.
that one. Yes, that is.
And renewables,
There's no question about that.
renewables are growing.
Yes, but
Um,
it still makes up only a small part.
Yeah, and it's growing
Very small part.
faster and faster. You see Saudi Arabia investing in renewables.
Yes.
That ought to tell you something. China is investing in renewables. India is investing in renewables. There is already there is already more oil than the planet can safely burn. And when I say more oil companies already have in reserve more oil than they can burn. Don't forget there's another external constraint, and that's the Paris Agreement and the obligation to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the desperate hope that the planet, global warming, will stay well below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, it's already increased a bit, and we're seeing extreme weather events, and we're seeing huge fires, which you mentioned last week, the fires in the Amazon, and also, of course, the fires in the Arctic and in Africa. So we are already seeing the results of global warming, and that's only with a very small increase. So if you say to me, oh, but we still have this industry and it's still got a future, no, it doesn't have a future. It absolutely does not have a future. And every day,
Well, it depends on what you mean by a future.
every
I
day
mean,
that we continue
we
to
know,
burn,
we all know.
every day we continue to burn fossil fuels is another day in which we put the planet closer and closer to catastrophe. And that is the hard scientific reality that people do not want to accept. And it is all there in the scientific reports produced by the IPCC. It's all there.
But
the science is very, very clear.
None of them will tell you, none of them tells you that you should abolish, you should shut it down. None of them.
But
does.
do you need them to tell you that? Isn't it obvious?
What they say is that you have to control it.
Now,
That's what they say.
What the science shows is that if humans continue to burn fossil fuels and put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, humans will trigger a catastrophe on the planet. And
of course it has to do with things like the Amazon preserving the rainforest, which helps to trap some of those things.
It has to do with a lot of things. You're absolutely right. The Amazon rainforest does take some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The oceans take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is why they're becoming more acid. As the planet gets hotter and the Arctic begins to melt, forget about the burning for a moment, and that emits more greenhouse gases. It's emitting methane, which is a really bad greenhouse gas. So the problem is getting worse. Now, I don't look to scientists to tell me what I should do. I look to scientists to give me an understanding of reality, to provide me with a proposition and then with evidence that backs up that proposition. Proposition is that greenhouse gases cause global warming and that global warming will destroy the planet. And there is more than enough evidence of that. So stage 2 is, well, what is your reaction to that? And everybody has a different reaction. Some people are saying, cut fossil fuels immediately. The World Bank has said that they will not fund any new fossil fuel exploration from now on or from next year. Don't ask me what they think they're doing in Guyana. I mean, it's a sort of sneaky kind of dodge to say that they're coming in here to help to strengthen or to revise the regulatory framework and to revise the laws. They have absolutely no business doing that, because they should not do anything to make it easier to extract oil.
Well, but surely, if they're coming here, and I'm not a defender of the World Bank.
Good, I'm delighted to hear that.
No, you don't need to say that.
Delighted to hear that.
You don't need to say that. I think you know me well enough. But the fact that they're coming to help with a regulatory framework must surely be a positive.
I don't know why you think they're coming to help, Christopher.
So what are you coming for?
Well, they're coming to do this project. That's quite different. And in this project, they will do certain things. And one of the certain things that they have said that they will do...
And the viewers, you said this project. The viewers don't know what you're talking about.
So let me tell
Maybe
them
you could introduce
I'll tell them about the project. So what the World Bank is saying is that as a new oil and gas producer, Guyana lacks the policy and legal and regulatory frameworks and institutional capacity needed to maximize the benefits from expected oil revenues and minimize the downside.
So you see, is that factual or not, in your view?
I think it is factual that Guyana is incapable of coping with oil at the moment. I don't think anybody can quarrel with that statement. We have a government that has demonstrated on a daily basis that it is incapable of handling oil. We have agencies that have demonstrated on a daily basis that they are incapable of handling the legislation that governs oil. They are incapable of complying with their statutory duties. So there's no doubt in my mind that Guyana is not ready and not able to deal with oil.
Do you believe we should have a depletion policy?
Tell me what you mean by a depletion policy. I'm looking for something else. Yeah.
It's the regulated exploitation of the resource, rather than you could have a situation where, for example, given our population, if we were to just have wholesale exploitation, you mentioned inflation, the resources that are going to be out there, the financial resources, going to be more than the economy can cope with. So a depletion policy is for an orderly extraction of resources. And you mentioned Botswana.
Botswana doesn't have oil.
I know Botswana does not have oil.
So it's a different proposition
No,
altogether.
ma'am, please.
No, it
Botswana did tell De Beers, look, you cannot exploit all the diamond that is there. We need to have a regulated and an orderly exploitation of it. So I'm drawing an analogy
Well, the analogy I think is an interesting one, but I don't find it convincing for the simple reason that diamonds and oil are two totally
Of
different
course
things.
they're different.
And they raise
But
different
the point
issues.
is this. The point is this. I'm asking, do you believe we should have a depletion policy or not?
Well,
Or have no policy?
I think what we should do is look at the product and say, so this is going to emit greenhouse gases. Is that actually an intelligent thing to do?
And you're saying no.
I would say on the 4th of September 2019, to start oil production is a very, very foolish thing to do. Oil has no future, and the sooner that people understand that, the better.
When you say oil has no future, how do you define the future? What sort of horizon do you place in this context of a future?
I would say within a few years. There simply is no carbon budget. And this message is taking a long time for people to understand. There is no carbon budget. The safe limit for greenhouse gases is 350 parts per million.
Yes.
The planet is already at 415 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
That means we have to take out the excess.
Yes.
There is no scope to put any more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because to do that is to destroy the planet, and no one has the right to do that.
Would you then say we should shut down all fossil fuel exploitation?
I think we have to do that. We have to stop fossil fuel use as fast as possible. And you hear this nonsense about a just transition, meaning that, well, it shouldn't be too much of a burden for the fossil fuel sector because people have jobs. They don't say, let's have a just transition which protects the people who have not been responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, but who are paying the price. For example, all those people who live in low-lying areas which are now flooded because of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
For example, people who fisheries are going to be depleted because of oil spills and so on, because oil is a problem the whole way
fishery
through.
being depleted is not only a question of oil spill, it's also a question of overexploitation.
Oh, absolutely. But if you limit it to the fisheries that are damaged by the oil spills, I think that would be sufficient. So when we talk about a just transition, we have to talk about the cost of oil to the planet and let the oil companies pay back that cost, and then we can have a just transition. Now, if I can just come back to the World Bank project for a
Sure.
moment, what this project says is that Guyana is highly exposed to natural disasters and thus far has not been very successful in transforming its natural resource wealth into productive capital or financial assets, despite international support. So that's the starting point. You have Guyana. The bank says it's highly exposed to natural disasters. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by that.
Well, maybe they're thinking of the fact that we are below the sea level,
So they maybe you think
and
that
our seawalls are not going to be able to protect us
right.
for very long.
So you think they may be thinking of rising sea levels,
Yes.
which is caused by global warming. Okay. Then they say thus far has not been very successful in transforming its natural resource wealth into productive capital. I think what they're talking about there is the various natural resources that Guyana has had over the years. So the gold, the diamond, the bauxite, the rice, the sugar, the timber. Resource after resource that has been squandered.
Well, is it just squandered, Melinda? Listen,
Mm-hmm.
if, and you talk about 87% with the oil companies, does this not have to do as well with the ownership of the resources? If you're going to have gold production
Mm-hmm.
and the significant ownership
Mm-hmm.
in the gold sector or in the mineral sector, gold, diamond, bauxite, manganese,
Mm-hmm.
and it all that money goes out there, are you blaming that sector or are you blaming the ownership and the political system that spawns the abuse and ensures or prevents the country from maximizing the benefits from those natural resources?
So with subsurface minerals, which is what you're mentioning here, gold, diamonds, manganese and so on, the state owns those resources. So that's you and your viewers.
I know the
and
state
so on.
owns it, but it's put under the control. Let's take of foreign companies.
Well,
So the money doesn't stay here. It has to do with the political and the economic system.
of course it does. And that perhaps that's what they meant by natural disaster.
Well, they can't mean that by natural disaster.
So what they say is despite average growth of 4% during the decade up to 2018, so from 2008 to 2018, the World Bank says that Guyana had average growth of 4%, but it still remains one of the poorest countries in the English-speaking Caribbean.
For the simple reason,
Mm-hmm.
or one of the reasons, that the gross domestic product does not address the question of ownership. It is only concerned with what is produced in the country, regardless of the nationality
Right.
of who
we
produces it.
We can agree that Guyana had this growth, but it still remains one of the poorest countries.
But I'm explaining to you why.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of reasons why, and that's one explanation. But if we just stick with it, 4% growth, still one of the poorest countries. And then they say that these years of what they call robust growth, which is the 4% over the 10 years, did not translate into commensurate levels of human development in Guyana. Roughly translated, people weren't any better off. So the ordinary Guyanese person is no better off. And that is...
That's not the interpretation I would put
Well,
in it.
what interpretation
Well,
would
if
you
you
put on
look, if you look at the social indicators,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the standard of living,
Mm-hmm.
there is no question that we have had improvements. We can't deny reality. We
Mm-hmm.
may question statistics, but we can't deny reality. And in any case, Melinda, I don't want us to go off oil. This is an oil study. So what are they saying about? Are they saying we shouldn't or we should?
Oh no,
Exploit.
the bank is very keen that Guyana should exploit the oil. So I don't, and the World Bank, as you know, has a terrible reputation when it comes to environmental protection. So what they say is they're coming in now to help Guyana, or to improve the management of the country. They had a project in Chad where they also helped Chad, and Chad is currently one of the worst countries in the world for human development. Chad is now 186 out of 189. The only countries below Chad are South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Niger.
Mm-hmm.
So when people think about World Bank projects, maybe they should think about the impact that those projects have had in other countries.
So do you think it's the World Bank's influence that has Chad where it is?
I think the World Bank going in and doing a project is problematic, and it certainly enabled the fossil fuels. Let me finish. It enabled Chad, it was a Chad-Cameroon pipeline, big promises that the people of Chad would benefit, and in fact it's turned out to be a disaster. So the lesson to take away from that is that when the World Bank makes promises about benefits to the people in the country, don't believe that. Ask for the evidence. Ask for evidence of World Bank projects that have actually improved people's lives. And when you get that evidence, then you can assess it.
Let's put this in context. How much does this project cost Guyana?
Oh.
What's the loan we're taking?
So this is 20 million US dollars.
20 million US dollars.
To
What is the total investment by the oil companies in the development of the oil sector?
I don't know what you mean by investment in the oil sector, Chris, because everything they spend they're going to get back out of Guyana's share.
That's a return. One is the
No,
investment.
so they spend some money and then we give it back to them. So that's the reality.
If we were to use your logic, then it's zero. No, it's not.
If you were to use my logic, then we would say that the oil belongs to Guyana, 100%, and Guyana gets 100% minus what it has to pay someone to take the oil out. It doesn't just hand over 87.5%. Well, actually, it's more than 87.5% it's handing over. But we'll come to that in a little while. We were talking about the World Bank's project of 20 million, which is a relatively small amount. They already spent about 1.5 million just to produce these few documents.
Lovely documents.
These lovely documents, yes. And they make a couple of other points. So they say, for example, while Guyana has made noticeable progress in reducing the overall gender inequality gap in the past decade, continuous efforts are needed. So what they're saying basically is Guyana needs to improve on gender equality. I don't know, well, the World Bank may like to look at what the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has said, because in July of this year, the CEDAW, which is the committee, noted with concern both the acute local negative impacts on women and girls posed by the extractive operations themselves, this is oil development, as well as the disproportionate...
Why are you limiting it to oil development? Why not the industries in the hinterland communities?
I'm telling you what the CEDAW was saying specifically about oil and gas. They had lots to say about communities in the interior.
Because we're not there yet with oil and gas.
Right.
We haven't started to produce oil and gas.
Right. So what they're talking about here is oil and gas. What they talked about elsewhere was extractive industries in the interior.
So is that about Guyana?
So this is specific to Guyana.
Well, we haven't started.
And this is specific to oil and gas. And what they're saying is, in light of these impacts, CEDAW recommended that the government of Guyana review its climate change and energy policies, and specifically its policies on the extraction of oil and gas, and develop a disaster risk reduction strategy that takes into account, let me finish, the negative impacts of climate change. Yeah, but I don't want,
because...
The negative impacts of climate change on gender equality, on the lives of women and their families, especially those living in areas below sea level.
Good. Fine.
So that's the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women.
Now,
and their concerns about oil and gas.
That's their concern, indeed.
Yeah. And their recommendation.
Excellent concern. How does the World Bank study positively or negatively address those concerns which the World Bank, which this document finds it necessary to identify and to emphasize?
Well, they don't actually address it as far as I can see. They mention that when it comes to gender inequality, Guyana ranks 117 out of 159, and that when it comes to women's economic participation, Guyana ranks 124 out of 145. And what they say is there's a bit about they will make sure that there are more women involved in the oil sector.
Well, is that something, $20 million, a loan or a grant of $20 million?
It's a loan.
It's not likely to affect the government policy if the government chooses, and if people like you, people like me, others, were to identify what is good and what is bad, and to call on our government and our politicians as to what to promote.
Well, people should call on the government to do things. I haven't noticed that it's made much impact, but I think people should carry on calling on the government and holding them to account. It's one of the big problems in Guyana is that people simply don't hold the government to account enough. They let them get away with doing things that they shouldn't get away with. So if we come back to this project, now what they say, because they want to deal with the legal and regulatory framework, and they've come up with this idea where they say that the Environmental Protection Agency is beleaguered by the complex and outdated environmental licensing and permitting process. So they're saying it's an outdated environmental licensing and permitting process, and that it's too complex. In fact, what they mean is that it's comprehensive, and it requires the oil companies to produce things like this, explaining exactly what they're going to do. This is only volume
But
1,
how
by the
could
way.
you take that and say that that's what they say is just the opposite of what they
No,
mean?
they're saying that it is outdated and complex. Licensing, environmental licensing and permitting process. It is a comprehensive licensing process. It is a comprehensive permitting process. And what they want to do is to tinker with that and make it, and I think there is a serious risk that they will make it easier for the oil companies to get environmental permits. Now, when they say that it is outdated, it is not outdated. It covers everything. It covers human beings, flora, fauna, species, habitat,
Well, if
soil,
anyone were
water.
to say it is outdated, I would say it does not address oil and gas.
It doesn't need to. It addresses the impacts of
Yes,
oil and
yes.
gas.
It does not address oil and gas.
It doesn't,
So, for example,
it doesn't address mining. It
Yes.
addresses the impacts
Yes.
of mining.
but there are peculiar issues
Such
to each of
as?
these things. Listen, I have spoken.
Such
With-
as with
I've
oil
spoken-
and gas.
yes.
What would you want to see in the Environmental Protection Act to do with oil and gas that you think would need to be added?
The areas in which they operate, the water quality
It's
of those
in-
areas.
It's in the
No,
Environmental
it
Protection
does
Act.
not. It does not address it.
It does.
You know,
It
Melinda,
talks about water.
I know-
It says
I know that-
identify, describe, and evaluate the direct and indirect effects
Or-
of the project on water.
So you think this act is perfect for the oil and gas sector?
I think this-
So what's your problem?
I think this act
So what's your problem?
holds the oil and gas sector to account. I think this sentence from the World Bank, that it is outdated, is a very dangerous sentence because it will lead to the act being, the protections being dismantled. You
But
said
is it not
water-
also? Is not
water.
also true? The most
Give-
they
give me
can come
another
up
example.
with. The most. No, forget that,
another
please.
example.
Forget that, please. Is it not also true that all they can do is come up with their ideas of findings and make recommendations?
So what the
They
bank,
can't make the laws for the country.
no, what they'll do is they'll bring in some consultants
Yes.
who probably don't know very much about Guyana's legislation, because that's the pattern. We've had consultants coming in time and time again, and we have a lot of legislation that's very poorly drafted because it was done under World Bank projects, DFID projects, you name it. There's a project. And so they come in, they don't understand what they're looking at, they mess things up, and then we're left to pick up the pieces. So I think there's a serious problem of competence when the World
So
Bank
you
interferes.
think we
You-
should leave the 1986 Petroleum Exploration and Production Act in place as it is?
I think we should have people in Guyana look at it. I've had a look at it. I don't think it's so bad. But my real concern is the World Bank coming in and saying that the environmental laws are outdated when they clearly are not outdated, when they are comprehensive, when they require the oil companies to say exactly what they're doing in every aspect of their production. So you mentioned water, it's in there. Climate change is also in there because it says they must describe the impacts on air and climatic factors. They're not doing that. The Environmental Protection Agency has not asked
And
the
you
oil
think
companies to do that.
you think that document to which you're pointing deals adequately with the waste product of the human activity as well as the petroleum activity?
So if you ask me, does the Environmental Protection Act create a system for dealing with that? The answer to that is yes, absolutely it does. If you're saying to me, does this thousand, however many hundreds and hundreds of pages does that meet the standards of the Act, then I would say that the answer to that is no. And in fact, I had written
But
to the EPA.
that's done under the legislation.
That's
is
done
it?
under the legislation. So, but the problem is not the legislation.
Well, let's get back to
The
to this.
problem it was that the EPA did not do its job, and I have for you, because you're always asking me about this and you don't believe me. And you must believe
we've
me.
gone through that before.
So I'm giving it to you.
No, we've
you
gone.
don't have to ask me about it anymore.
I have one. I have it.
We asked
Melinda.
about it last week.
No, but I have a
You
copy.
found it now, have
No.
you? Good.
No. Sarcasm has no place on this program.
No,
It
but
really
you asked
doesn't.
me about the 4,000 barrels of sewage
Yeah.
last week, and you asked me if it was a typo. So I've brought you the paper which shows 4,000
But-
barrels, and it's not a typo.
No. The question we have is this. What is the alternative
The alternative to
to exploiting our petroleum resources?
I think long before we get to the stage of saying, oh, what are we going to do instead, there are certain things that we must first do. And so one thing that Guyana absolutely must do is make sure that the oil sector is obeying the laws as they exist right now, and that the government is obeying the laws as they exist right now. So we must have a petroleum sector. We must have a petroleum sector that respects the rule of law. We don't have that at the moment. You cannot come into a country and undermine the rule of law, and you cannot respect a government that doesn't obey the rule
Are
of
you
law.
suggesting that the legislation is adequate, the 1986 legislation is adequate, but we don't have the policing of it?
I'm not suggesting that the petroleum legislation is adequate. What I'm saying is that it is already being breached, and so long before we decide to do anything with the legislation, we should stop the illegal activity that is going on right now.
What's the illegal activity in petroleum?
Well, the
Operations.
minister, for example, is supposed to make a determination that that is the best use of the resources. How is that the best use of the resources when there are other options, and when more than 87.5% of the resources are being given away? Transparency International was in the paper today.
You know that you keep repeating it.
Yeah.
But Melinda, that is not true.
What?
It is not 87%. I don't
It's
know why you.
87.5% that they take before Guyana gets anything.
That
and they
is
don't
not.
pay for it.
That is not true.
Yes, it is.
It's based, Melinda. It's based on oil price, which you nor I know with any certainty what it will be next week, let alone next year.
It's not.
It's based on cost of production.
It's based.
We don't know that
They
either.
take. If you have 100% of production, they can take up to 75%.
They can take.
in any.
But that's a
one.
different story.
Right, so
it's
they
not
are
they
en-
can take.
They are
Also,
entitled to
it
take.
is misleading to say they can take.
They
what
are
it's-
entitled
What
to
it
take.
says is that cost oil in any one year must not exceed 75% of revenue.
They are-
That's what it says.
So they are entitled to take out 75% for their costs. And
If
by
that
the
is
way,
the case,
well,
if that
why
happens,
why would they not? So
because you can have cost of production much less than 75% of revenue.
well, you may think that the oil companies will not do it, but when a contract says that this is what you are permitted to do, that is what you take. Bear in mind also that they have already taken from this as much oil as they require for their operations.
Yes.
So that doesn't even get counted. And I think people are really struggling with this because they can't understand how bad this contract is for Guyana. And people, it's going to be really, really difficult.
Well,
But they're going to have to understand
it's
because
interesting
they're
you
going
make-
to live with the impact
It's
of
interesting you make that point, because you say the legislation, you didn't say it's very good.
it.
But you don't have a big problem.
I said...
But the minister made that agreement under the legislation.
So I'm glad
He's
you-
authorized to make
No,
it.
he's not. So
He is.
If you come back, so as I was saying, Transparency International today are in the paper saying that the entire agreement is illegal as being contrary to the Procurement Act. They have a good point. That probably needs to be investigated. If you look at the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act, it doesn't say that the minister can enter into a petroleum agreement in the form that he did. It said that he may, and it sets out some and there are some limits as to what he can do. He doesn't have the power to just sign anything he thinks he wants to sign because he happens to get up that day and think that he just wants to sign this. And then later when you ask him why, he's incapable of giving an answer. I mean, TI also asked, is this grand corruption or grand incompetence? And we're still to get an answer from any minister as to whether this is
a fair question?
Grand incompetence
Is that a fair question?
Or grand corruption.
It suggests that there's only corruption or incompetence.
Well,
is there no middle way?
Well, ask the minister, don't ask
No, I'm
me.
asking you. You're making the point.
No, I'm saying
you're defending it.
This is what TI has asked, and I totally support TI in every question that they ask a minister, because when you become a minister, you are completely accountable to the population, and you must answer those questions. Ministers have no business dodging and hiding because they don't like uncomfortable questions.
That's an interesting point, because that goes to the governance issue on the oil course. You mentioned Shad and all these other places.
Yes.
Now, is that the beef we have with the contract that the environment, apart from the environmental issues, the governance issues?
Oh, I think governance is absolutely a serious problem. We have always had a problem with governance in Guyana, and in fact this World Bank thing starts off by saying that despite the fact that Guyana has all these natural resources, Guyana hasn't been able to translate that into real wealth. And they warn, they say, if poorly managed, oil and gas resources can be economically and socially costly for the country.
Yes, yes.
Failing to lead to sustainable economic growth. Notice sustainable economic growth.
That applies to any sector of the economy.
Poverty
if it's
reduction
badly
and
managed.
Prosperity. Yes. And so we have, in fact, a history of very bad management of the nation's assets and resources.
Let's look at it this way. Now, we all have our concerns about the IMF and the World Bank, and even possibly the IDB. Who would you like to see advising Guyana on an energy policy, a regulatory framework, a financial infrastructure that protects not only our today's revenue, but for the benefit of the long term of our country?
No idea. I'm not going to give you an answer off the top of my head, but if you want an answer to that, I will go away and do the research and give you a well-reasoned response.
You don't like the IMF. You don't think the World Bank is a good set of people to do it.
I don't want there to be any ambiguity about this. I think that the World Bank's intervention in Guyana's oil sector will have negative consequences for Guyana, and there is a serious risk that the World Bank will dismantle the existing environmental protection, and the Guyanese people need to be aware of that and not take these things on trust and not hope that things will be all right.
For all the discussions that have been taking place, including the past tonight and last week, where these issues are identified, do you not see the Guyanese population becoming conscious and alert and monitoring what will happen? We have half a second.
Some, yes. Others are in a dream world and have bought the lies of vast wealth that Mr. Trotman and others have been telling them. But there is hope, because there are some people that are becoming more and more concerned.
Ms. Melinda Janki, thank you very much for appearing on Plain Talk this week. I think we have a lot to think about.
Thank you very much,
Operators and viewers,
Chris.
thank you. Good night. See you next week.